Japan, 1945. Part 1. The Battlefield Awakens, a Storm of Steel and Blood. The island of Okinawa, once a paradise of lush greenery and serene beaches, had been transformed into a hellish landscape where life and death danced in a cruel, chaotic rhythm. The year was 1945, and the battle for Okinawa was one of the bloodiest conflicts in the Pacific theater of World War II. The once pristine forests were now scarred by craters, the air thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder, smoke, and death. The sky, heavy with dark, swirling clouds, seemed to press down on the earth as if mourning the destruction below. Private First Class Daniel "Danny" Thompson had never imagined that his journey would lead him to such a place. He was just a farm boy from Indiana, accustomed to the quiet life of rural America. The scent of freshly plowed fields, the sound of cicadas on warm summer nights, and the simple joys of home were all distant memories now, replaced by the relentless brutality of war. Danny had grown up in a small town where everyone knew each other, where life was predictable, if not always easy. But nothing had prepared him for the horrors he now faced daily. Danny crouched low behind the remnants of a concrete bunker, its once formidable walls now pockmarked with bullet holes and chunks of debris. His uniform, heavy with sweat and dirt, clung to his body, and his helmet, slightly askew, bore the marks of close encounters with death. His rifle, an M1 Garand, was his constant companion, the cold steel a reminder of the reality he could not escape. Around him, the battlefield was a cacophony of chaos. The sharp crack of rifles, the deafening roar of artillery, and the screams of men echoed through the trees, blending into a nightmarish symphony of war. The ground was littered with the detritus of battle, discarded weapons, shattered equipment, and the lifeless bodies of soldiers who had once been full of hope and dreams. The forest floor, once soft with moss and leaves, was now churned into a muddy quagmire, stained red with the blood of the fallen. Danny's heart raced in his chest, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He had been in Okinawa for weeks, each day a blur of violence and survival, but the fear never left him. It was a constant, gnawing presence in his gut, a reminder that at any moment, his life could be snuffed out like a candle in the wind. He had seen too much, lost too many friends, and the weight of it all threatened to crush him. As he peered over the edge of the bunker, Danny's eyes scanned the battlefield. He could see his fellow soldiers, their faces grim and determined, as they fought to hold the line. The enemy was relentless, their attacks fierce and unyielding. The Japanese soldiers were well hidden in the dense foliage, using the terrain to their advantage, launching surprise attacks from the shadows. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse, and the stakes were life and death. Danny's thoughts drifted to his family back home. He could picture his mother, her kind eyes filled with worry, and his father, a stern but loving man who had taught him the value of hard work and integrity. They had sent him off to war with heavy hearts, their prayers following him across the ocean. He wondered if he would ever see them again, if he would survive this nightmare and return to the life he had left behind. But there was no time for reflection. The enemy was advancing, and Danny had to stay focused. His training kicked in, the months of drills and discipline taking over as he fired his rifle, the recoil jolting through his body. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, a temporary shield against the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. Every shot was a battle for survival, every breath a reminder that he was still alive, for now. The ground shook as an explosion rocked the forest, the force of it nearly knocking Danny off his feet. Dirt and debris rained down around him, and he instinctively ducked, his hands gripping his rifle tightly. When the dust settled, he risked a glance over the bunker once more, his heart pounding in his ears. The battlefield was a scene of devastation, the once green forest now a wasteland of splintered trees and smoking craters. It was in this moment, amidst the chaos and destruction, that Danny heard it for the first time, a voice clear and calm, cutting through the noise of battle like a knife through butter. "Danny! Over here!" The voice was unlike any he had ever heard, neither loud nor insistent, but carrying an undeniable authority, as if it spoke directly to his soul. Danny froze, his senses on high alert. He glanced around, his mind racing. The voice had seemed to come from within him, yet it was distinct and real, as if someone were standing right beside him. But when he looked, there was no one there, only the twisted remnants of the forest and the ongoing battle. "Help him, Danny. He's right there behind the fallen tree." The voice came again, calm yet commanding, urging him to act. Danny hesitated, his mind grappling with the impossibility of what he was experiencing. But something deep within him, a gut feeling, a sense of purpose, propelled him to move. He rose from his crouched position, his movements cautious but determined. Trusting the voice, Danny made his way through the chaos, keeping low to avoid the bullets that whizzed past. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the fallen tree, its massive trunk splintered and scarred by gunfire. There, partially hidden by the thick underbrush, he saw the figure of a soldier, motionless and bloody. Danny's breath caught in his throat. It was Sergeant James "Jimmy" O'Hara, a man he had come to regard as both a mentor and a friend during their time together in the trenches. Jimmy was one of the best, a tough-as-nails Irishman with a sharp wit and a heart of gold. Danny had shared countless meals and stories with him, finding solace in their camaraderie amid the horrors of war. Now, Jimmy lay on the ground, his leg mangled by shrapnel, his face pale and clammy. "Jimmy!" Danny's voice cracked with a mix of fear and relief. He dropped to his knees beside his friend, his hands trembling as he assessed the damage. Jimmy's eyes fluttered open, his expression one of pain and confusion. "Danny, I thought I was done for," Jimmy murmured, his voice weak. His usually bright eyes were dim, clouded by the agony of his injuries. "Not today, Jimmy. I'm not letting you go that easy," Danny replied, his tone firm despite the turmoil raging inside him. He could feel the pressure building, the urgency of the situation, the weight of responsibility, the overwhelming fear of losing another friend. But the voice was there, steady and reassuring, guiding him through the fog of war. "You need to stop the bleeding, Danny. Use your belt." The command was clear, and Danny obeyed without hesitation. He pulled off his belt, threading it around Jimmy's thigh, just above the wound. As he tightened the makeshift tourniquet, Jimmy let out a pained groan, but the bleeding slowed, giving them precious time. Danny's mind raced as he worked, the reality of the situation settling in. They were still in the thick of battle, surrounded by danger on all sides. The enemy was close, and they couldn't stay exposed for long. But he couldn't leave Jimmy behind. He wouldn't. With the tourniquet in place, Danny hoisted Jimmy's arm over his shoulder, lifting him as gently as he could. Jimmy grimaced, but he managed to stand with Danny's help, his weight pressing down heavily. "We need to move, Jimmy." "I'm getting you out of here," Danny said, his voice resolute. The fear in his chest was still there, but now it was tempered by a strange sense of purpose, a determination that hadn't been there before. The voice had shown him the way, had led him to his friend in the moment of greatest need. And for reasons he couldn't explain, Danny felt an unshakable confidence that they would make it out alive. As they began to move, Danny glanced back at the fallen tree, half expecting to see someone or something. A figure, a shadow, anything to explain the voice he had heard. But there was nothing. Just the scarred landscape and the ever-present roar of war. But Danny didn't have time to dwell on it. He had a mission now, to get Jimmy to safety, to survive the day, and to keep moving forward, no matter what. And as they stumbled through the forest, with the sounds of battle echoing around them, Danny couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Someone was guiding him, watching over him, and in that moment, it was all the reassurance he needed to keep going. Part 2. The Voice in the Chaos, an Unseen Guide. As Danny navigated the dense underbrush with Jimmy leaning heavily on him, the battlefield around them was a swirling maelstrom of chaos and destruction. The cries of the wounded, the constant barrage of gunfire, and the thunderous explosions that shook the earth made it hard to think, hard to focus. But amidst this storm of violence, there was a strange, almost surreal calm that had settled over Danny. It wasn't the calm of acceptance or resignation, but something different, something unexplainable. The voice. It was the only thing that cut through the chaos with clarity. The calm yet insistent voice that had called his name guided him to Jimmy and instructed him to use the belt to stop the bleeding. Danny couldn't shake the feeling that this voice was more than just a product of his imagination. It was as if someone or something was there with him, watching over him, leading him to safety. As they moved through the forest, Danny's senses were heightened. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made him tense, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew the enemy could be anywhere, hidden in the shadows, ready to strike. But the voice had given him a strange sense of confidence, a belief that they would make it through. "Keep moving, Danny. You're almost there," the voice spoke again, clear and reassuring. Danny didn't question it this time. He simply obeyed, trusting that the voice would guide him to safety. He had no idea where they were going. His sense of direction had been obliterated by the chaotic terrain and the constant movement of battle lines. But the voice seemed to know. Jimmy's breathing was labored, each step a struggle for him. His leg was in bad shape, and Danny knew they needed to find medical help fast. But in this hellish landscape, finding a medic was easier said than done. The forest, once a sanctuary of life, was now a twisted labyrinth of destruction, where every step could be their last. As they trudged forward, Danny's mind raced with questions. Who or what was this voice? Was it divine intervention, a guardian angel sent to protect him? Or was it just the product of his exhausted, traumatized mind? He had heard stories from other soldiers, stories of miraculous escapes, of mysterious figures appearing in the heat of battle to save lives. He had always dismissed them as war stories, tales spun to bring comfort in the face of unimaginable horrors. But now, he wasn't so sure. "Danny, stop!" the voice commanded suddenly, its tone more urgent. Danny froze, his senses on high alert. He tightened his grip on Jimmy, his eyes scanning the area. At first, he saw nothing, just the ruined landscape, the remnants of trees and the haze of smoke that hung in the air. But then, he noticed it, a glint of metal, barely visible through the thick foliage. His heart skipped a beat as he realized what it was, a tripwire expertly hidden among the debris. A single step forward, and they would have triggered a deadly explosion, wiping them both out in an instant. Danny's breath caught in his throat as the reality of how close they had come to death sank in. "Thank you," Danny whispered, though he wasn't sure who or what he was thanking. He carefully led Jimmy around the trap, his mind spinning with the implications of what had just happened. The voice had saved them. There was no other explanation. Without it, they would have walked straight into the enemy's trap, and that would have been the end. "Danny, to your left," the voice spoke again, this time softer, almost as if it were standing right next to him. Danny turned, and through the smoke and debris, he saw a figure, another soldier lying on the ground, motionless. The sight sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. Could it be another comrade in need of help? He carefully set Jimmy down, making sure he was hidden behind a fallen log for cover. "Stay here," Danny whispered to Jimmy, who nodded weakly. Danny then crept toward the figure, his rifle at the ready, every sense on high alert. The figure wasn't moving, and as Danny got closer, he saw the blood, a deep crimson pool spreading beneath the soldier's body. "Is he alive?" Danny's thoughts raced, and his heart ached at the sight. Every loss was a blow, each fallen comrade a reminder of the brutality of the war. But as he reached the soldier, Danny saw something that made him pause, a faint rise and fall of the chest, a sign of life. "Help him, Danny." "He's still breathing," the voice urged, and Danny didn't hesitate. He rolled the soldier onto his back, revealing a young man, barely older than himself, with a pale face smeared with dirt and blood. The soldier's eyes flickered open, and he let out a weak groan. "Hang in there, buddy," Danny said softly, his voice filled with determination. He quickly assessed the soldier's injuries, a gunshot wound to the abdomen, bleeding heavily. It was bad, but there was still a chance. Danny tore strips from his uniform, fashioning them into bandages. His hands moved with a precision that surprised him, a steadiness that belied the turmoil inside him. As he worked, the voice guided him, telling him what to do, how to apply pressure to slow the bleeding, how to keep the soldier's airway clear. "Stay with me, man. We're gonna get you out of here," Danny murmured, his words a promise not just to the wounded soldier, but to himself. He wasn't going to lose another one. Not if he could help it. As Danny tended to the soldier, he couldn't shake the feeling that the voice was more than just a guide. It was a presence, almost tangible, like someone was there with him, guiding his hands, calming his nerves. It was as if a protective force had enveloped him, shielding him from the horrors around him, allowing him to focus on saving lives. Time seemed to blur as Danny worked, the battle raging on around them. He could hear the distant shouts of his comrades, the echo of gunfire, but it all seemed muted, distant. His entire world had narrowed to the task at hand, to saving this young soldier's life, to getting him and Jimmy to safety. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Danny finished bandaging the soldier's wounds. The bleeding had slowed, and the soldier's breathing, though shallow, was steady. Danny felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew their ordeal was far from over. They were still in the middle of a battlefield, still surrounded by danger. "Take him with you, Danny. There's a safe place not far from here," the voice instructed, and Danny didn't question it. He carefully lifted the soldier, balancing his weight as best he could. Then he returned to Jimmy, who looked at him with a mixture of pain and trust. "Ready to move, Jimmy?" Danny asked, his voice steady. Jimmy nodded, though his expression told Danny all he needed to know. Jimmy was hanging on by a thread, and they needed to find help, fast. With Jimmy leaning on one shoulder and the wounded soldier slung over the other, Danny began to move again, his steps heavy but determined. The weight of the two men bore down on him, his muscles burning with the effort, but the voice was there, urging him on, giving him the strength he needed to keep going. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees twisted and blackened by fire, the ground uneven and treacherous. But the voice guided Danny through it all, leading him on a path that seemed to cut through the chaos, as if it had been carved out just for them. "Almost there, Danny. Just a little further," the voice encouraged, and Danny clung to those words like a lifeline. He could feel his body reaching its limits, the exhaustion threatening to overwhelm him. But he couldn't stop. Not now, not when they were so close. Finally, after what felt like miles, Danny saw it. A small, hidden bunker, half buried in the earth, its entrance camouflaged by the surrounding foliage. It was an old supply depot, abandoned and forgotten in the chaos of battle, but it was shelter, a place where they could rest, regroup, and maybe, just maybe, survive. Danny staggered toward the bunker, his breath ragged, his vision blurring with fatigue. He lowered Jimmy and the wounded soldier to the ground, their bodies slumping against the bunker wall. The effort had drained him completely, but the relief of finding safety kept him going. "Get them inside, Danny. You've done well." The voice spoke again, softer now, almost gentle. Danny nodded, though his entire body ached with exhaustion. He dragged the two men into the bunker, his movements sluggish, his mind a fog of fatigue and adrenaline. Once inside, the silence was almost deafening. The sounds of battle were muffled, distant, as if they were a world away. Danny collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving with the effort of breathing, his mind spinning with the events of the day. The bunker was dark, lit only by the faint light filtering through the cracks in the ceiling. It smelled of damp earth and old supplies, but to Danny, it was the most welcoming place he had ever seen. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the cool air wash over him, calming his frayed nerves. "Rest now, Danny. You're safe," the voice whispered, and for the first time, Danny felt a deep, overwhelming sense of peace. He had survived the impossible, guided by a voice he couldn't explain, a presence that had been with him every step of the way. As he drifted off to sleep, Danny's last thoughts were of gratitude. Gratitude for the voice that had saved him, for the strength that had carried him through, and for the hope that maybe, just maybe, he would make it out of this war alive. Part 3. A Beacon in the Dark. The mission continues. The darkness inside the bunker was a welcome change from the chaos outside, but it was a fragile refuge, one that could be shattered at any moment. Danny sat against the cool, earthen wall, his breath still coming in heavy gasps as his body tried to recover from the ordeal. Jimmy and the wounded soldier were both unconscious, their labored breathing the only sounds breaking the silence. The small, cramped space smelled of damp earth and the faint, metallic tang of blood, a constant reminder of the battles they had just fought. Despite the exhaustion pulling at him, Danny's mind wouldn't let him rest. The events of the day replayed in his thoughts, the voice that had guided him, the close call with the tripwire, the discovery of the wounded soldier. It all felt like a surreal dream, but the aches in his muscles and the weight of his gear reminded him that it was all too real. Danny glanced over at Jimmy, whose face was pale and strained, even in sleep. The tourniquet had stopped the bleeding, but it was only a temporary solution. Without proper medical attention, Jimmy's chances were slim. The same was true for the other soldier, whose breathing was shallow and unsteady. They needed help, and they needed it soon. "Danny, you need to move," the voice returned, as clear as before, breaking through Danny's spiraling thoughts. There was no hesitation in the tone, just a quiet urgency that compelled him to action. "There's more work to be done." Danny's heart sank at the thought of leaving the relative safety of the bunker. His entire body was screaming for rest, but the voice wouldn't allow it. The mission wasn't over yet, and deep down, Danny knew the voice was right. He couldn't stay here forever, not with Jimmy and the soldier in such critical condition. With a groan, Danny pushed himself to his feet, his muscles protesting every movement. The dim light made it difficult to see, but as his eyes adjusted, he noticed something glinting in the corner of the bunker, a small metal box partially buried under a pile of debris. Curious, Danny knelt down and pulled the box free. It was an old supply crate, the paint chipped and rusted from years of neglect. Inside, Danny found a small stash of medical supplies, bandages, morphine, and a few syringes. It wasn't much, but it was more than he had hoped for. He let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding, a wave of relief washing over him. It was as if the voice had known the supplies would be there, guiding him to exactly what he needed. Danny wasted no time. He carefully administered the morphine to Jimmy and the soldier, watching as their pained expressions eased slightly. It wasn't a cure, but it would buy them more time. He bandaged their wounds as best he could, using every bit of the supplies he had found. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was enough to stabilize them for now. "Good, Danny. Now, listen carefully," the voice spoke again, and Danny leaned in, as if he could better hear the disembodied guide. "There's a path through the forest, just beyond this bunker. It leads to a clearing where you'll find reinforcements. You need to go now." The thought of leaving Jimmy and the wounded soldier behind made Danny's stomach churn, but the voice was insistent. "Go, Danny. They'll be safe here, but they won't survive if you don't bring help." Danny hesitated, glancing back at his unconscious comrades. The idea of venturing out alone into the forest, back into the heart of danger, terrified him. But the voice had been right so far, about everything. It had led him through the worst of the battle, saved him from the tripwire, guided him to the wounded soldier, and now it was telling him to leave. He couldn't afford to doubt it now. "Okay," Danny muttered, more to himself than to the voice. He grabbed his rifle, slinging it over his shoulder, and took one last look at Jimmy and the soldier. "I'll be back, I promise." With a deep breath, Danny pushed open the heavy door of the bunker and stepped out into the night. The forest was eerily silent, the sounds of battle distant now, a low rumble on the horizon. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and damp earth, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides, swallowing up the faint light of the moon. Danny moved cautiously, his senses on high alert. The path the voice had mentioned was faint, barely discernible among the twisted roots and debris that littered the forest floor. But it was there, a narrow trail that wound through the trees, leading deeper into the woods. As he walked, Danny couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch made his heart skip a beat. The forest seemed alive, a living, breathing entity that could turn on him at any moment. But the voice was there, a constant presence in his mind, guiding him, reassuring him. "Keep going, Danny. You're on the right track," it urged, and Danny pressed on, his steps quickening despite the fatigue that weighed him down. The path twisted and turned, leading him through dense thickets and around jagged rocks, but he never lost his way. The voice was always there, steady and unwavering, pulling him forward. After what felt like hours, the trees began to thin, and the darkness gave way to a faint glow ahead. Danny's heart raced as he approached the clearing, his eyes straining to see what lay beyond. As he broke through the last line of trees, he found himself standing on the edge of a small, open field, the ground scorched and pockmarked by craters. And there, on the far side of the clearing, was a group of soldiers, American soldiers. They were huddled together, their faces drawn and weary, but their uniforms were unmistakable. Danny's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was seeing. Reinforcements. The voice had been right. They were here, just as it had said. "Danny, go to them. They'll help you," the voice instructed, and Danny didn't need to be told twice. He broke into a run, his exhaustion forgotten in the rush of adrenaline. The soldiers turned at the sound of his approach, their eyes widening in surprise as they saw him emerge from the trees. "Help! I've got wounded men, back in the forest," Danny shouted, his voice hoarse from the exertion. He could see the soldiers exchanging looks, their expressions shifting from shock to urgency as they realized the gravity of the situation. One of the soldiers, a sergeant with a grim face and a stern demeanor, stepped forward. "Show us where, son," he said, his tone commanding but not unkind. Danny nodded, breathless, and turned back toward the forest, the reinforcements following close behind. As they made their way back to the bunker, the voice fell silent, but its presence lingered in Danny's mind. He didn't know what it was or where it had come from, but it had guided him through the darkest hours, leading him to safety when all hope seemed lost. When they reached the bunker, the reinforcements quickly set to work, their movements efficient and practiced. They stabilized Jimmy and the soldier, lifting them onto stretchers with care. Danny watched in a daze, the weight of the day finally catching up to him. His body ached, his mind numb with exhaustion, but a deep sense of relief washed over him. They were safe now. Jimmy and the soldier were going to make it. As the reinforcements prepared to move out, the sergeant approached Danny, his expression serious but grateful. "You did good, soldier. You saved their lives today." Danny nodded, too tired to speak. He glanced back at the forest, where the path had disappeared into the darkness, and for a moment, he thought he heard the voice again, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper of approval. "Thank you," Danny whispered, not knowing if the voice could hear him, but feeling the need to say it anyway. Whatever it was, it had been his beacon in the dark, his guide through the chaos. And as the soldiers began their journey back to base, Danny felt a deep sense of gratitude, for the voice, for the strength it had given him, and for the hope that had kept him going. The mission wasn't over, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Danny believed they might just make it through this war alive. Part 4. The Final Push. Courage in the face of desperation. As dawn began to break over the horizon, the faint light of the rising sun cast long shadows across the battlefield, revealing the devastation that the night had wrought. The once dense forest was now a scarred wasteland, its trees shattered and its underbrush trampled by the relentless march of war. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and gunpowder, and the distant rumble of artillery fire served as a constant reminder that the battle was far from over. Danny stood with the reinforcements at the edge of the clearing, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy. The relief of finding the reinforcements had been short-lived. The soldiers were exhausted, their faces lined with the weariness of men who had seen too much. They had expected to find respite, a moment to catch their breath and regroup, but the voice in Danny's head had warned him that there was no time to rest. "Danny, the enemy is coming. You need to prepare," the voice had said, its tone urgent, pulling Danny back to the grim reality of their situation. He knew what the voice meant. Their position was compromised, and it was only a matter of time before the enemy regrouped and launched a counterattack. The soldiers around him were already making preparations, digging shallow trenches, setting up makeshift barricades, and checking their weapons with practiced efficiency. Danny's heart pounded in his chest as he joined them, his hands trembling slightly as he loaded his rifle. The memory of the previous night's horrors was still fresh in his mind, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. The clearing offered little in the way of cover, just a few scattered boulders and the remnants of a fallen tree. It was far from an ideal defensive position, but it was all they had. Danny crouched behind one of the larger rocks, his eyes fixed on the tree lean where the enemy was likely to emerge. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant sounds of battle that echoed through the air. Danny's thoughts turned to Jimmy and the wounded soldier, now safely behind the lines with the medics. The knowledge that they were out of harm's way gave him a small measure of comfort, but it did little to quell the anxiety that gnawed at his insides. He had no idea how many enemy soldiers were out there or when they would strike, but he knew they were coming. "Stay alert, Danny. They'll be here soon," the voice reminded him, its calmness a stark contrast to the tension that gripped him. Danny nodded to himself, tightening his grip on his rifle, his knuckles turning white with the strain. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity as Danny waited for the inevitable. The other soldiers were equally tense, their eyes darting between the tree lean and each other, seeking reassurance in the presence of their comrades. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, until finally, it was shattered by the sound of distant footsteps, the crunch of boots on dry leaves. Danny's heart skipped a beat as he strained to see through the trees. At first, there was nothing, just the dense underbrush and the shadows cast by the early morning light. But then he saw them, figures moving through the trees, their forms barely visible in the dim light. The enemy was approaching, and they were close. "Hold your fire," the sergeant whispered, his voice low but firm. The soldiers tensed, their fingers hovering over their triggers, waiting for the order to engage. Danny could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, his senses sharpening as the enemy drew nearer. The first shots rang out suddenly, a burst of gunfire that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The clearing erupted into chaos as bullets whizzed through the air, striking the ground and the barricades with deadly precision. Danny ducked behind his rock, the sound of gunfire deafening in his ears. He could feel the vibrations in the ground as the enemy's artillery opened up, sending shockwaves through the earth. "Danny, now!" the voice commanded, and without thinking, Danny popped up from behind his cover, his rifle aimed at the nearest enemy soldier. He squeezed the trigger, feeling the recoil as the shot rang out. The soldier went down, disappearing into the underbrush, but there were more, so many more, emerging from the trees like a tide. The battle was intense, the air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Danny fired again and again, his movements almost automatic as he switched between targets, his training taking over. The enemy was relentless, their numbers overwhelming, but the voice kept him focused, kept him moving, guiding him through the chaos. "Move to your left, Danny," the voice urged, and Danny obeyed without question, rolling to his left just as a grenade exploded where he had been moments before. The force of the blast sent dirt and debris flying, but Danny was already on his feet, firing into the smoke at the shapes that moved within it. The enemy was closing in, their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm the small group of American soldiers. Danny's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he fought to keep them at bay. The rocks and barricades that had provided cover were slowly being chipped away, leaving them more exposed with each passing moment. But amidst the chaos, Danny felt a strange sense of clarity, a calmness that didn't belong in the midst of such violence. The voice was with him, guiding him, telling him when to duck, when to move, when to fire. It was as if time had slowed, the world around him reduced to a series of moments, each one critical, each one potentially his last. "Don't let them break through, Danny. You're almost there," the voice encouraged, and Danny gritted his teeth, pushing himself harder. He could see the enemy faltering, their advance slowing as they encountered the fierce resistance put up by the American soldiers. The battle was far from won, but there was hope. Hope that they could hold the line, that they could survive this final push. The minutes dragged on, each one a lifetime in itself. Danny's arms ached from the constant recoil of his rifle. His body screamed for rest, but he refused to give in. He couldn't afford to. Too many lives depended on it. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the gunfire began to taper off, the enemy's advance slowing to a crawl. Danny blinked through the smoke, his vision blurred by sweat and exhaustion, trying to make sense of what was happening. The enemy was retreating, their ranks breaking as they fell back into the forest. "We did it," Danny whispered, hardly daring to believe it. The voice was silent now, its job done, but Danny could feel its presence lingering, a quiet reassurance that he had done what was needed. The clearing was a scene of devastation. Bodies, both friend and foe, lay scattered across the ground, the earth stained with blood. The surviving soldiers, their faces drawn and pale, began to emerge from their cover, their expressions a mix of relief and disbelief. They had held the line against all odds, and the enemy was in retreat. Danny collapsed against the nearest rock, his body trembling with the release of adrenaline. He had survived. Somehow, against all odds, he had survived. And as he sat there, staring at the rising sun, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the voice that had guided him, for the strength it had given him to keep going, and for the hope that, maybe, the end of the war was finally in sight. Part 5. The Unseen Guide, A Soldier's Redemption. The sun climbed higher in the sky as the remnants of the battle settled into a grim silence. The once chaotic clearing now lay still. The only sounds the distant murmurs of soldiers tending to the wounded and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. The air was thick with the smoke of gunpowder and the heavy scent of blood, a stark reminder of the price that had been paid. Danny remained seated against the rock, his mind reeling from the intensity of the battle. His body was covered in grime and sweat, his uniform torn and stained. He could barely move, his muscles aching with fatigue, but there was a quiet sense of accomplishment within him. They had held the line, and the enemy had been forced to retreat. The sergeant approached Danny, his face etched with both relief and exhaustion. "You did a hell of a job out there," he said, clapping Danny on the shoulder. "We wouldn't have made it without you." Danny managed a tired smile, nodding his thanks. The sergeant's words were a balm to his weary spirit, but there was still a part of him that struggled to grasp the enormity of what had happened. The battle had been fierce, and the cost had been high. But the voice, always there, guiding him through every step, had been his constant companion, his unseen guide in the midst of chaos. As the soldiers began to gather and assess the aftermath, Danny took a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought him here. The voice had been more than just a guide. It had been a lifeline, a source of strength and clarity in the darkest moments of the conflict. It had led him to the wounded, helped him navigate the perilous terrain, and provided him with the courage to face the enemy head-on. He wondered about the nature of the voice. Was it a figment of his imagination, a product of the stress and trauma of war? Or was it something more, a guardian angel perhaps, watching over him in his time of need? The questions lingered in his mind, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, but they did little to diminish the sense of gratitude he felt. As the day wore on, the soldiers began the grim task of collecting the dead and tending to the wounded. The clearing was slowly transformed from a battlefield into a makeshift field hospital, with medics working tirelessly to stabilize those who had been injured. Danny helped where he could, his own exhaustion momentarily forgotten as he assisted with the tasks at hand. Jimmy, now conscious and looking much better, was being treated by a medic. Danny approached him, his heart lifting at the sight of his friend's familiar face. Jimmy looked up, his eyes meeting Danny's with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Danny," Jimmy croaked, his voice weak but filled with emotion. "I thought I was a goner." "Don't talk," Danny said gently, placing a hand on Jimmy's shoulder. "You're going to be okay. We made it." The two friends shared a brief, silent moment of understanding. Words seemed unnecessary. There was a bond between them that went beyond mere speech. Danny's actions had saved Jimmy, and the shared experience of survival had forged a deeper connection between them. As night began to fall, the soldiers gathered around small fires, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. The mood was somber but hopeful, the camaraderie forged in battle evident in their shared stories and quiet conversations. Danny found a place by one of the fires, his body still aching but his spirit buoyed by the company of his fellow soldiers. The voice had been silent since the battle ended, its guidance no longer needed. But Danny could still feel its presence, a comforting memory of the strength and clarity it had provided. He didn't know what the future held or when the war would end, but he was filled with a renewed sense of purpose. As he sat by the fire, staring into the flames, Danny thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The battles, the hardships, the moments of fear and doubt, they had all been part of a larger story, a story of survival and redemption. The voice had been a crucial part of that story, guiding him when he was at his most vulnerable and leading him to victory when all hope seemed lost. "Hey, Danny," the sergeant's voice broke through his thoughts. "We're heading back to base tomorrow. You should get some rest." Danny nodded, grateful for the sergeant's concern. He lay down on his bedroll, the warmth of the fire a soothing contrast to the chill of the night air. As he closed his eyes, he whispered a quiet thank you to the unseen guide that had been with him through it all. In the quiet of the night, Danny drifted into a restless sleep, his dreams filled with the echoes of the battle and the voices of those he had fought alongside. The war was far from over, and the road ahead was uncertain, but Danny felt a deep sense of peace. He had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, guided by a voice that had shown him the way. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Danny knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the same courage and determination that had seen him through this battle. The voice had been a beacon in the dark, and its memory would guide him in the days to come. The war raged on, but Danny was ready. He had found his strength, his purpose, and most importantly, his hope. And as he prepared to move forward, he carried with him the knowledge that even in the darkest of times, there was always a light to guide him home. If you enjoyed this story of courage and hope, don't forget to like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and let us know what you'd like to see next. Until the next story of faith, God bless you.